Section 8. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria by William Westgarth. Some interjector in re Batman, pioneer of the Port Phillip settlement. Mr. Edward Henty from Launceston first entered the future Victoria in 1834 by her remote portal, Portland Bay, and thus became the founder of the colony. In the following year, John Batman of Hobart, sailing from the same stirring little Launceston, entered by the central and grander portal of the Port Phillip Heads, and was thus the pioneer of Port Phillip settlement. For we must really turn blundering Collins, with his abortive doings in 1803–4, out of the running. I never saw Batman, as he died the year before my arrival, so that, according to my rule, I have nothing to say of him. But I must mention an incident occurring shortly before my date, and characteristic of the times, namely, the raffling for Batman's old and well-smoked begrimed pipe. This was at the famous Lamb Inn, a little wooden edifice on the north side of West Collins Street, opposite the Market Square, and fronting a small cliff which the street levelling there had left for future disposal. There were 30 tickets at £1 each, and the fortunate winner was to compensate the disappointed by standing champagne all round. I was once in the Lamb Inn ere its glories had quite expired, as might be inferred from a charge of 4 shillings for a bottle of cider, for which I had called in support of the house, and to while away time in waiting for a friend. I had to share it with 2 others who happened to be in the room, the waiter having promptly filled the 3 tumblers he had brought, without even Robert's professional stereotype of "by your leave," the tumblers, too, being as promptly emptied without any ceremonious bother about acknowledgment. The Lamb Inn lived a brief space longer, but utterly bereft of its old position in the revels and extravagance of every kind of the young settlement, and was finally levelled out of existence in company with the cliff at its back. But I have to do also with nearer and dearer connections of Batman than his tobacco pipe. I have to record the marriage, during 1844, of 2 of his daughters, the elder, already a widow, Mrs. McKinney, to my pleasant friend Fennell, as I have previously mentioned, and happily resulting in a family of descendants to the Port Phillip founder, and the younger to one of the 2 squatter brothers Collier. The latter event, which came off at the hospitable and comfortable homestead of old John Aitken of that ilk, I mean of Mount Aitken, was a grand gala time to a very wide circle. Guests, by the score together, trooped up from town and country, headed in the former direction by Andrew Russell, then second Mayor of Melbourne, in succession to my friend Condell, and in the latter by his cheery and ever-smiling uncle, Peter Inglis, of Ingliston, a great station homestead in the comparisons of those early times, and once, as Peter liked to tell, taken for a town, perhaps in the gloaming hours, by a bush traveller when he inquired of one of the domestics, to her great amusement, the name of the street he had confusingly got into. Mrs. Aitken, as literally as by courtesy the good wife of the house, and then in the full charm of her beauty and strong youth, now Mrs. K, and sadly changed in both respects, went busily about, her young family at her skirts, administering plenty and preserving order, while, towards genial eve, her good man occupied a quiet corner, indisputable king of the nonce of the toddy race. The night accommodations were a difficulty, although not a few, like the host himself, were in no great want. I and a score or two of others turned into a wool loft, where a number of little mattresses, mostly of a pro-Renata kind, were provided, into one of which I was soon ensconced and fast asleep. But well on, as I guessed, in the small hours, we were all awoke by loud and burly noise in the loft, proceeding, as we soon recognised, from two Anakims of the party, Isaac Buchanan and John Porter, who seemed on the eve of a struggle for a mace or Nolan belt. Porter had retired peacefully with me, but Buchanan had been viewing in the toddy corner with his host, and when inevitably knocked under, for the other had not yet been limited by his doctor to that woman's wash, as he called it, sparkling Moselle, he had contrived to find the common loft. It is said, of unpractised toppers at any rate, that, after an extra indulgence, they either see nothing or see double. Whichever it was with Buchanan, he insisted on berthing for the night in Porter's occupied nest, while the latter, after standing the all-round chaff for a little, got savage and threatened war. Buchanan's sight getting by and by clearer, the remainder of the night was, happily, peace. But it was not for long, as almost with the dawn our host, alive as if nothing out of the usual had happened, woke us up with the invitation to finish the champagne by way of refresher after all the toils and toddy we had gone through. Dr. Thompson of Geelong. This earliest amongst the earlier Port Phillip, whose active form flitted about its shores ere the memorable year 1835 had expired, might have come in for a full separate sketch had I been thrown more with him, so as to have sufficient personal data. But, although I met him at times, he lived at Geelong, 50 miles away from Melbourne. I have put him under this sub-heading, in the Batman interjector, because, as his daughter, Mrs. Henry Creswick, told me, it was Batman's representations to him of the land of promise to the north that induced him to follow the early tide with his flocks and his family, the latter consisting of his wife and one only child, the daughter above alluded to. She still survives in her pleasant residence, situated in the fitly named Creswick Street, Hawthorn. The doctor was one of the most active of the colonists, both politically and generally. He was chiefly concerned in establishing the Geelong Corporation, of which he was several times mayor, and he was most actively interested in the early representation of the district in the Sydney Assembly. He sat there as one of the district members prior to the separation session of 1851, and it was at his instance that the House made an exhaustive inquiry into the condition of the aboriginal natives. In the separation session elections his party was outvoted by the squatting or anti-democratic element, but none the less the former in Geelong deputed the doctor to accompany the elected members, in order to keep a watch upon their doings. The case had its comic aspect, but, as the doctor and I were on the same side of the politics of the day, he was most useful to me in our common effort to secure a due share of representation for the mass of the people, as intended by the Imperial Government. The aim of the reigning regime was to continue their power by means of an electoral distribution, which was to secure a majority of Crown nominees and Crown tenants in the two future sections of the old colony. The doctor, as I said, went over with the earliest from the Hobart side of the island, quitting his land grant, which was the last under that system, and was got for him by his friend Governor Arthur, a privilege for which, as I have said, the Henty family arrived just too late. Amongst the livestock he took over was Miss Thompson's pony, which was the first of the equines landed at Port Phillip. Its owner was then a very young girl. She and her mother landed towards the end of 1835, and were the first ladies of the settlement. The family pitched a tent almost under a magnificent gum tree, whose stump, covered with ivy, still exists close to the cathedral of Prince's Bridge. But shortly after several of the young men of the settlement, in order to provide them better accommodation, collected some boards and built them a hut lower down the river bank. With the two places the Thompsons were able to dispense hospitalities. Their guests, including Messrs. Gellibrand and Hesse, Mr. James Smith, and Mr. McKillop. It used to be said the settlement was in the habit of going to tea with Mrs. Thompson. This brings us into 1836. The next year came the officials in charge from Sydney, who included Mr. R. S. Webb as Collector of Customs, whose daughter Annie was the first white child born in the settlement, with, however, some dispute as to a blacksmith's child having been the first, and who was afterwards married to my late friend Colin Mackinnon, younger brother of the better known Lachlan. Dr. Thompson used to read prayers to the little settlement in a rude structure upon the ground now occupied by St. James's Church. Afterwards he removed to Cardinia, Geelong, as his livestock had been landed there, and this place he finally made his home. From these lively and mixed events of our early society, let me now turn to another subject, which is neither less lively nor less mixed than its predecessors, the subject, namely, of John Pascoe Fawkner, father of Melbourne. The force of his own merit makes his way. Henry VIII. Well, I am not fair, and therefore I pray the gods to make me honest, as you like it. He's honest on mine honour. Henry VIII. He hath a heart as sound as a bell. His tongue is the clapper, for what his heart thinks, his tongue speaks. Much ado about nothing. For now he lives in fame, though not in life. Richard III. If circumstances won't make a poet, as genius contemptuously asserts, nor make up for blood in a horse, as even the stable boy swears to, they are at times marvellously effective in making, and, for the matter of that, also in unmaking men. So might we say with regard to the well-known subject of this sketch, who, arriving amongst us with the earliest, and within the repellent surrounding of an evil repute, yet under different surroundings and favouring circumstances, outlived all traducements, whether true or otherwise, and after a long, practical, and singularly useful career, died in the full regard of his adopted country. The unanimity of dislike and moral depreciation with which he was regarded by his Tasmanian fellows was not indeed without a certain share of reason or excuse. That he was the son of a convict ought not, of course, to prejudice him in these Christian days, when the sins of the fathers are not to be visited upon the sons even to the first generation. His father arrived with Colin's prisoner party, and the boy, John Pascoe, then 11 years old, was sent with his parent, for not seldom were wives or children thus sent with the convicts, to ameliorate by such a touch of nature the hard features of a society of adult vice, much as Hogarth, in some of his masterpieces of the human woes or vices of his time, gives, in striking contrast, a foreground of maternal affection, or of children at play in the artless innocence of their looks and ways. But he was probably neither a pretty nor an interesting boy, for as a man he was of the very plainest, with a short figure, always negligently put on, a rough, mannerless way, and a voice husky and hoarse, although redeemed at times into an approach to commanding an audience, when he was strongly stirred in some exciting cause. Some people have no patience to subdue natural antipathies in such cases, and these people would, as well-known scripture, with some transposition of the idea, tells us, be apt to be most plentiful in his own country. But, again, Fawkner was himself a convict. Yes, but for what? Certainly if a man so notorious in after life had committed any very disparaging crime, it must have been as notorious as his name. But I never heard anything distinctive beyond that he had, for something or other, passed under the Caudine Forks of the Van Diemen's Land criminal courts. Inevitably his early upbringing was in low associations, where, probably, ties of friendly feeling survived, as to which he might have said with the Bard of Avon, "I am not of that feather to shake off my friend when he must need me." Timon of Athens. My impression was that he had been convicted of harbouring, or aiding to escape, some who had broken the law, whatever more that may have meant, for, with his pluck, he was probably little troubled about niceties of fine feeling, and thus accounted Providence dropped the man amongst altogether different circumstances and associations in his new location. I had much to do with Fawkner, especially after he and I met in our young colony's first legislature, and after I sufficiently knew him, so as to allow for the rough exterior of his nature. I never had but one opinion of the man. That opinion was, that throughout every condition of the considerable space of his later life, whether in health or sickness, strength or weakness, prosperity or adversity, for, at first at least, he, like many others, was not prosperous in Golden Fleeced and Golden Victoria. He toiled, late and early, for what, in his honest judgment, was for the good of his colony, and with a singleness of purpose which was not excelled, was not, I think, equalled, to my knowledge at least, by any other in that colony. He seemed to make an ascent under the exhilarating circumstances of his new and increasingly responsible position, and to have the consciousness of a great mission, which nerved him to surmount all that was dubious in his earlier career. Nor was he behind in less pretentious ways. I never once heard of any mean or overreaching act of his, even in the smallest matters. He once told me, in his prosperous days, with much becoming feeling, and as an incident he could never forget, that when quite broken in fortune he had received, as unasked as unexpected, a most timely pecuniary help from Mr. Henry Moore, the well-known solicitor. The two were, I think, at hearty variance across the political hedge, the more honour to both. We have seen that he showed pluck in his earlier life, even in bad associations, and he displayed the same under better auspices later on. His action with a certain gravely suspected Commissioner of Crown Lands was a good illustration. This high functionary, who in those pre-constitutional times was practically an irresponsible Caesar over a vast estate of dependent Crown tenants, whose interests might in any case be seriously jeopardised by any unfairness, and who, therefore, like the wife of his prototype, should be even above suspicion, was accused by rumours of no slight noise or breadth of unfaithfulness to his charge, and in the grossest and most mercenary of forms. Even with the clearest case it was anything but assuring to attack such a man in those days of authority. But Fawkner's bite was too deep for any laissez-faire cure, and so, nolens volens, the Commissioner had to defend or retrieve his character. The verdict of a farthing damages, at which amount the jury estimated that character in the case, was complete justification to Fawkner, and laid the whole province under lasting obligation to him for a most important public service. Another of his more prominent services was among the first Gold Commission, 1854-5, summoned hastily together by the Governor, Sir Charles Hotham, under the surprise, not unmixed with consternation, caused by the Ballarat riot, an incident which, in some of its aspects, such as the stockade structure, deserved rather the graver name of rebellion. Already in his 63rd year, in broken health, and certainly the weakest physically of the membership, he was the most active of all, ever running full tilt into every abuse or fault or complaint that might help to explain this unwonted, and indeed utterly purposeless and stupid incident of a British community. In my capacity as chairman, I appreciated Fawkner's untiring, or more properly, unyielding spirit, and under travelling fatigues, too, of no mean trial even to younger men. For the Colossus of Rhodes, as my energetic friend, Dr. (now Sir Francis) Murphy, was humorously called, on accepting, recently before the charge of the rutty and miry ways of golden Victoria, had as yet made but feeble progress in his most urgent mission. We learned enough to explain, at least, if not to excuse the miners, and were thus guided to a reconstruction of Goldfields administration. This was chiefly in that national element, hitherto utterly absent there, of local representative institutions, and the change has since assured the future from even John Bull's proverbial growling. General MacArthur, with a few troops, promptly but not without considerable bloodshed, ended the sad farce. In view of the very exceptional features of an incident extremely unlikely to occur again, Fawkner and most others of the Commission were most decided for a general condonance, and this was agreed to in the report by all except the official Commissioner, Mr. Wright, who, excusably enough, sided with his official superiors for a treason trial. But the jury, as might have been anticipated, acquitted the prisoners. One of their leaders, Mr. Peter Lalor, who lost one of his arms in the cause, has since been for many years Speaker of the Victorian Assembly, and as loyal to his Queen as he is genial to his many friends. When we wound up the Commission's inquiry at Castlemaine, and on the morning of a hot midsummer day embarked upon one of the springless cobencoes of the time, with the prospect of 10 or 12 hours of terrible jolting before us. Poor old Fawkner seemed so much enfeebled, that I was in some doubt as to his being landed alive at Melbourne. But game to the last, he rode uncomplainingly through all, and he lived even a goodly number of years after, but only to do more and more work. Old General Anderson, of early colonial memory, had a habit, quite his own, of saying to the face of anyone whose conduct gave him satisfaction, and in his blunt soldierly way, "Sir, I have a great respect for you." Such an accrediting and not unacceptable declaration he addressed, times more, I think, than once, to Fawkner. Indeed, all classes of the colony, from the highest in which the gallant colonel moved, to the humblest, now alike recognised the veteran who had so long and so well fought for them all. When at last the spirit quitted the worn-out frame, and its well-known form, possibly, even to the last, keeping up still amongst some few, the lingering dislike of the long past was to be no more seen amongst us, there seemed but one impulse for the occasion, which fittingly expressed itself in a funeral procession entirely unprecedented in its every aspect. This was not less to the colony's honour than to that of Fawkner. He died on 4th September 1869. Not the least impressive feature of the funeral, perhaps the most, was the remarkable prayer offered up at the grave by Reverend Dr. Cairns, Victoria's most eloquent preacher, in giving the true setting to the life and character of the man. Thank God, in the name of the colony, for such a life, the influence and example of which could not but be for good to all who were to follow. He has fought bravely for the R.I.P. of the tomb. He rests from his labours, and his works do follow him. End of section 8.